Before we toast, my mother said, stealing the microphone from my husband's hand, everyone should know. She's adopted. 150 guests froze with their champagne halfway raised. My mother smiled like she had finally put me back in my place, in front of the people who were supposed to bless my marriage, while my father sat beside her with his fingers tightening around his glass. I didn't flinch. Then my husband took the microphone back. Let me introduce her real family. 5 chairs scraped against the floor. My mother's smile cracked, and my father's glass slipped from his hand and shattered at his feet. My name is Della, and I was 29. To understand why, we have to go back to 1996. If you've ever sat at a table where your place felt borrowed, where you understood, without anyone saying it, that you were allowed to stay only as long as you were grateful enough, then you already know the shape of this story. Stay with me, because the woman holding that microphone thought she was ending mine. She had no idea what I'd spent the last 2 years learning about the night I was born. Keep your eyes on the 5 people at table 6. Everything turns on them. The chair I sat in for Christmas dinner was the one closest to the kitchen door. It was where you put the person who'd be getting up the most, refilling water, fetching the gravy boat, carrying plates back to the sink when my mother lifted 2 fingers off the tablecloth, a small gesture that meant the table needed something and that I was the one who'd rise. I never questioned it. By the time I was old enough to wonder, the seating had hardened into something that felt less like a choice and more like a law of physics. The Hartwells sat along the window side, where the candlelight was good. My father, a small-town doctor who never quite set the work down, sat at the head of it. I sat by the swinging door, and every time it opened, a thin draft moved across the back of my neck. The story came out every year, somewhere between the prayer and the pie. My mother would set down her fork and fold her hands, and she'd tell the room about the year they brought me home, how they hadn't been able to have another after my brother, how they'd prayed on it, how a door had opened in Louisville, and there I was, 18 months old in a donated snowsuit. "We didn't have to take you, sweetheart," she'd say, turning to me with her eyes shining, the whole table following her gaze to my chair by the door. We chose to. The room would go warm and soft. My uncle would say they were saints, the both of them, and my mother would wave the word away, the way she waved off every compliment she'd arranged in advance to receive. And I would sit there with the heat climbing the back of my throat, smiling on cue, because that was my line in the scene. The rescued one. The girl glowing with gratitude. I'd learned that line before I learned to read. What moved through me in those moments wasn't love. It was the careful arithmetic of a child who knows the bill is always being added up somewhere, even when no one holds the pen where you can see it. So I learned to be useful. I learned to be easy. When my brother put a baseball through the den window, it was boys being boys, and my father laughed about it for a week. When I left a cabinet door standing open, my mother would cross the room without a word, close it slowly, and then turn and look at me until I felt the draft on my neck again, the one that meant the door was right behind me and could swing either way. She never raised her voice. The looking was the whole sentence. It wasn't until much later, reading other people's families for a living, that I understood what I'd been taught at that table. Gratitude was the rent on my place, and rent is something you can fall behind on. I found the tin the summer I turned 13, looking for tape. It was pushed to the back of the hall closet's top shelf, an old Danish butter cookie tin gone soft with rust at the seams. Inside were the documents. A court decree with a gold seal pressed into the corner. A yellowed hospital form with 2 tiny footprints stamped in ink faded to the color of weak tea. A few overexposed photographs of a brick building I didn't recognize. And underneath all of it, folded into a square of yellowed tissue, a small medal on a thin ribbon. I held it up to the closet light. A saint's medal. Cheap, silver-colored metal gone dull, the face worn nearly smooth. If I tilted it, I could make out a woman in robes with her hands open, and along the bottom edge, a line of lettering too small to read. The ribbon had been cut at one end and sewn back together, the stitches close and then loose and then close again. Done by hand, done by someone whose hands, I thought even then, had not been steady. I carried it down to the kitchen. My mother was slicing apples, and she glanced at the metal in my open palm. That? She turned back to the cutting board. Just something from the home. It came pinned to your things. Toss it if you want. I asked what it was, what the home was, whose it had been. She set the knife down. She told me she had no idea, that those places handed out all kinds of little charity items, and that I really shouldn't go digging in old paperwork because it would only confuse me and stir up things that didn't need stirring. Then she crossed the room, took the tin out of my hands, gently the way she did everything that was actually a command, and slid it back onto the high shelf, out of reach. The metal she let me keep. It wasn't worth the argument, and a scrap of dull metal couldn't tell me anything she didn't want me to know. That was the math behind letting it go. I should have let it go too. A worn medal from a building I would never see, pinned to a baby who couldn't remember any of it. I kept it anyway. I moved it from jewelry box to jewelry box for 16 years, and I never knew why. For most of my childhood, the woman who gave birth to me was alive only as a sentence. The girl who gave you up. That was the phrase, always delivered the same way, with a small, sad shake of the head. A teenager from a poor family, my mother told me. A girl who'd done the loving thing and let me go so I could have a real life. There were no names in the sentence and no details, and I learned early not to ask for any, because asking did something to my mother's face I couldn't undo once it started. The strange part, the part that would sit on me later like a stone, is that I grew up to do work that should have made me suspicious years before it did. By 24, I was a paralegal at a small firm in Asheville that handled adoption and coercion cases, reading a great many consent forms until I developed an ear for the difference between a signature and a surrender. I spent my days inside other people's worst paperwork. I just never turned the lens around and pointed it at my own beginning. Because every time I drifted near it, at 16, at 20, the handful of times I worked up the nerve to ask a real question, my mother would press 2 fingers flat against her sternum, and her chin would tremble, and her eyes would fill. "Do you have any idea," she would say, the tears arriving right on schedule, "how much it hurts me when you bring her up?" And somehow, within 90 seconds, I'd be the one apologizing. Crossing the room to hold her hand, promising I hadn't meant anything by it, that of course she was my mother, my only mother, that I'd never ask again. The grief in the room was always hers to spend. There was never any left over for the girl in the sentence, and certainly none for the child by the door, learning one more time that her curiosity was a wound she inflicted on the people she depended on. So I stopped asking. For years, I stopped asking entirely. The case landed on my desk on an ordinary Tuesday in the spring of 2020. It wasn't mine to run. I was a paralegal. I organized and summarized and built the binders. But I read everything cover to cover, and this one I could not put down. A woman in her 40s was suing over an adoption at a Catholic maternity home in Kentucky in the early 90s. As I worked through the file, the pattern in it made the skin on the back of my neck go cold. A frightened girl sent away to have the baby out of sight. 6 weeks of isolation. Her family kept at the length of a phone the home controlled. And then, within a day of giving birth, a consent signed while she was still bleeding, still half under from the delivery, still being told this was God's plan. Renata Solis, the lead attorney, stood in the doorway while I tagged documents with colored flags. "Look at the timing on that consent," Renata said, coming in to tap the form. "Sign that fast, with the family kept out of the room. The girl still on the drugs from delivery. That's not a choice, Della. That's something somebody else wrote for her and then guided her hand across." I nodded. I said something professional about chain of custody. I kept flagging. I did not tell Renata that something in my chest had quietly stopped working at the word home. I did not tell her that I'd been born in a Catholic maternity home in Louisville, or that I'd read the intake packet for our client's home twice now and recognized the language. The same phrases, the same waiver structure, the same 48-hour window, because I had a yellowed form just like it in a butter cookie tin on a high shelf in my parents' house. I told myself, driving home, that thousands of these adoptions had been clean, that a matching form proved nothing, that I was a professional pattern matcher seeing a pattern where there was only coincidence. I went home and sat in my parked car for the better part of an hour before I could make myself go up. Their timeline matched mine to the hour. It took me 4 years to do what I did next, and the gap is the whole story of how I was raised. I could spot coercion in a stranger's file in an afternoon. I could not, for the length of an entire presidential term, make myself request my own records. The fear would not move. If I went looking, I might find something that cost me the only family I had. My mother would press her fingers to her chest, and the door by the kitchen would swing shut, and this time it would not swing back. But in the first cold months of 2024, with my hands not quite steady, I requested them. The package took weeks. When it came, I let it sit on the counter, unopened. 3 more days. And then, one night around 1 a.m, when I couldn't pretend to sleep anymore, I opened my laptop and the scanned file with it, and I read the name of the woman who had signed me away. Sarah Coyle, 16 years old. A consent executed 19 hours after delivery, with no attorney present and no independent counsel of any kind. 16. I read it 3 times to be sure the number didn't change. And then, lower in the file, in a follow-up record, a status note from some earlier administrative search typed by a clerk who had no idea what it would do to whoever read it. The kitchen tilted under me. Sarah Coyle, living Bowling Green. My mother had a name and a pulse. I didn't sleep that night. I rebuilt the room instead. I put it together piece by piece, from the documents and from everything I knew about how those places had worked. A 16-year-old, 6 weeks inside a ministry that read her outgoing mail and screened the visitors who tried to reach her. A delivery, a recovery room. And then someone sitting at the edge of the bed with a clipboard and a soft, certain voice, a pen held out. The words, "This is the loving thing," while the drugs were still thick in her blood and her body didn't quite belong to her yet. Her own mother, I'd learn later from Sarah's family, had driven 3 hours to that home when she heard. She had stood at the front desk and asked to see her daughter, and been told, politely, that it wasn't a good time, and been sent back to the parking lot and back down the highway. 3 hours home without ever getting past the lobby. They had turned away a grandmother at a front desk and called it ministry. There is a particular grief that arrives when you understand you spent your whole life mourning the wrong loss. I'd been told my mother let me go. I'd carried it as a low, permanent hum, the unwanted child made bearable by the story that the giving up was itself a kind of love. I had built half of who I was around being unwanted in a tender, forgivable way. I sat at that counter and finally cried, but not for myself. My hands were flat on the cold stone, and for a long moment I genuinely could not lift them. I cried for a teenage girl I'd never met, alone in a room 19 hours after the largest and most frightening thing that had ever happened to her body, with a pen in her hand that someone else was all but holding. They had not taken a baby from a woman who didn't want her. They had taken a baby from a child nobody let say no. And the cruelest part, the part I kept circling back to that night, was the shape of the story they'd built on top of it. They hadn't just taken me, they'd taken her. No, erased it, and then handed me a different story to grow up inside. A story where she had wanted to give me away. Where the loss was a gift. Where I owed my whole life to the people who'd received me. I had been raised on the exact inversion of what happened. Every Christmas, the rescue. Every birthday, the gratitude. A lie told so gently, so often, that it had become the floor I stood on. It was the kindest lie I was ever told, and I'd believed it for 28 years. The cursor blinked in the empty message field for the better part of a year. I had Sarah Coyle's address by the summer of 2024, and I did nothing with it. I drafted letters and deleted them. Dozens, some 3 words long and some 3 pages. There was the old fear, and there was something with a paper trail. A thing my mother had called a spiritual covenant, presented at the kitchen table when I turned 18, with candles and a little ceremony. It was full of soft, churchy language about honoring the family God had chosen for me and turning my face from the past. I'd signed it the way I signed everything in that house, to keep my seat. Some animal part of me had filed it away as a leash. In March of 2025, with Theo asleep down the hall, I typed 4 sentences and, before I could delete them a 41st time, I sent them. I told her my name. I told her my date of birth, the 12th of August, 1996. I told her I believed she might be the person who'd given birth to me, and that she never had to answer. The reply came 6 days later. I read it on my feet at the kitchen counter, one hand pressed over my mouth. "I have thought about you every single day," Sarah had written. "I was afraid you'd never want me to." 6 days, then a reply that broke me clean in half. She didn't reach to hug me when I walked into the cafe. It was a place off the highway near Bowling Green, the kind with sticky, laminated menus and coffee left too long on the burner, and she'd chosen the booth in the very back where she could see the door. I knew her before I'd consciously decided I knew her. She was 45, still in scrubs because she'd come straight off an overnight ICU shift, the creases under her eyes from the work and from the years. When I slid into the booth across from her, she didn't say hello. She looked at my hands where they rested on the Formica. Then Sarah reached over and touched my hair. Once, very lightly, tucking a piece of it behind my ear the way you would with a small child you were afraid to startle. "You have my mother's hands," she said. We sat there 4 hours, and most of it, we did not talk. When we did, she told me the safe things first. That she was a nurse. That she'd married a good man named Tom. That there were 3 more after me. And her face did something complicated when she said it. Hope and fear braided together. At one point, I started to apologize. For finding her, for dragging the worst year of her life back into the room. Sarah put her palm flat on the table, and the apology stopped in my throat. "I'm not asking to be your mother," she said, holding my eyes. "I'm asking to be allowed to know you." Our coffee went cold. At some point, her hand was resting next to mine on the table, not holding it, just there. 2 sets of the same knuckles an inch apart. And I understood that she had waited 29 years for a permission she'd never been allowed to ask for. 4 hours, almost no words, and somehow, everything said. There were 3 of them, and I met them the way you wade into cold water. One careful step at a time. Bridget was the oldest, 22, and taught 2nd grade, and within 10 minutes, I noticed she talked with her hands in the exact chopping way I do when I reach the important part of a sentence. Nobody had taught either of us that. It just lived in both of us. Connor was 19, home from college. He shook my hand first, very formally, then hugged me hard and stepped back with his ears red, not knowing what to do with his arms. He kept finding reasons to refill my water glass. I recognized the impulse. I'd been the one who refilled the glasses my whole life. And Maeve was the youngest, 17, and the quietest. The first time I came to the house, she barely spoke. Near the end of the afternoon, she slid a folded piece of paper across the table without a word. It was a drawing, worked over many times in pencil. A young woman, with my face. "I drew you from the only picture Mom had," Maeve said, looking at the table instead of at me. "I always knew what you'd look like." The photograph, Sarah told me later, was a single shot she'd taken in the hospital in 1996 on a cheap disposable camera in the few hours she'd had with me before they came. The only image of me she'd been allowed to keep, Maeve had grown up with it, taped inside the front cover of a sketchbook, and she had drawn me over and over, at 6 and 12 and 16, aging up a baby she'd never met. Then Sarah told me one more thing, standing at the counter with an uncut cake on it. Every August 12th, on my birthday, she lit a candle and set a full place at the table, plate, fork, folded napkin, and left the chair empty. She had done it for 29 years. Her 3 children had grown up understanding, without being told the whole story, that the seat at the August table belonged to someone who might one day come home. A seat she set for me every August. While I sat by the kitchen door, learning to earn mine, the fear didn't leave once I'd found them. If anything, it sharpened to a point. I drove back toward Lexington one Sunday evening with both maps open on my phone. One route to my parents' house, where the seat by the door was waiting, and one back to Bowling Green, where a candle got lit on a day that had always belonged to someone else's story. My hand stayed locked at 10 and 2 the whole drive, knuckles white over the wheel, the old arithmetic running in a loop. If my mother ever found out I'd gone looking, she would not merely be hurt. She would make me choose. And she would build the choosing so completely out of love and grief and everything I owed her that, whichever way I turned, I would lose. I said all of it to Theo that night, sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets because I couldn't make it to a chair. Theo Cardoza was a lawyer too, at a nonprofit doing reproductive rights work, and I'd met him through a case 3 years earlier, and he was the first person I'd cried in front of since I was 14. He didn't try to fix it. He came and sat down on the floor beside me, shoulder against mine, and listened until I'd run out. "You don't have to choose between them yet," Theo said. "You just have to stop pretending you don't have them." I knew he was right. I also knew exactly what it would cost when the pretending ended. There were 2 families now, and the way my mother had built the world, holding on to one of them meant a wound to the other. 2 families. And one of them I was going to have to wound. The one witness who could end it weighed almost nothing and was dying in a care home outside Louisville. His name was Father Linus Caro. In 1996, he'd been the counselor at St. Bridget, the priest who sat at the edges of those recovery room beds with his soft, certain voice and his clipboard. He was 78 now, in the last stretch of a long illness, and somewhere in the slow work of dying, he'd decided he no longer wanted to carry it. Renata's team found him through one of the other women in the case. He gave a sworn affidavit, and because no one could say how many weeks he had left, the firm took his testimony a second way as well, a deposition recorded and preserved under oath. Near the end, an attorney had asked him how the home presented these decisions to the girls. His answer ran on its own line, and I read it more times than anything else in the file. "We told those girls it was God's will," Father Linus said. "It was paperwork, and it was money." The affidavit named the whole machine. It described the physician the home kept on call, the doctor who signed the forms attesting that each girl was of sound mind, competent, acting freely, the white coat over the whole arrangement. In the portion I was cleared to see, the doctor wasn't named. But there was a 1996 capacity attestation sitting in the broader record and a set of handwritten initials in the signature block, and I sat very still, looking at those initials for a long time. His testimony had an expiration date. We were racing a dying man's lungs. I knew exactly which piece of paper my parents were guarding. The trouble for them was that it was the wrong one. My mother believed the adoption itself was a fortress, a final decree signed by a judge, sealed by the court. Decades old and untouchable. As long as that decree held, she reasoned, the past was locked behind it, and she'd had me sign a covenant on top of the lock for good measure. She had stationed herself year after year, standing guard at the door of a vault. But a final decree cannot launder a consent that was never legally given, and it certainly cannot hide a signature that was forged. I want to be precise. because the precision matters. I was not trying to undo my own adoption. I was 29. That ship had crossed the ocean and been scrapped for parts decades ago, and undoing it wasn't remotely what I wanted. What I wanted, for myself, was narrow and quiet. My original record corrected, my true origin set down accurately after a lifetime of fiction. What Sarah and 6 other women wanted was larger. An accounting from the institution that had taken their children. The civil case Renata was building one affidavit at a time, where the fight over the statute of limitations would be uphill and the discovery rule argued for months. None of it was guaranteed. All of it was real. And I was a daughter and an adoptee caught in the gravity of the whole thing, walled off by the firm's ethics rules from the corners of the case that touched my own father's name. None of that ran through the decree my mother was protecting. The danger to the Hartwells lived somewhere else entirely, in a forged attestation and a dying priest's recorded voice. She had built her entire wall around the wrong door, and she had no idea the real one stood open. The envelope arrived 9 days before my wedding. Certified mail, the kind someone has to sign for in person. I wasn't at the house when it came, but Theo told me, and I remember the exact flatness of his voice. My father had been served, named in the institutional case, pulled in over the attestations he'd signed across years for the home that placed me. And the family I'd quietly found and quietly invited was already confirmed for the reception, seated by my own hand at table 6. Then, in the days that followed, my mother went silent. No call, no tearful confrontation, no fingers pressed to the sternum. From a woman whose entire operating system ran on managed emotion and arranged sympathy, the silence was the loudest thing she'd ever done. "Your dad got served," Theo said, the night before the wedding. "And neither of them has said one word to you about it. That's not peace, Della. That's a plan." I told myself it would be fine. But I'd lived in that house 18 years, and I knew the weather, and I knew what that stillness meant. Silence from Patricia was never safe. It only ever meant she was deciding where to put the knife. The microphone was still warm from Theo's hand when she took it from him. We were 11 words into the toast. The string lights were up across the rafters. The champagne had been poured down every table, and 150 people were on their feet with their glasses lifted in the parish hall of St. Catherine, my mother's parish, where she chaired the Women's Guild, the room she herself had chosen down to the linens. The band had just let the last note fade so the toast could begin. Somewhere a glass clinked, then went quiet. Theo had just said my name, and my mother crossed the floor in 3 quick steps and lifted the microphone right out of his fingers with the bright hostess's smile from the Christmas cards and turned to face the room. She didn't rush it. She let a breath go by. "Before we toast," she said, "everyone should know she's adopted." The words went out over the speakers, too loud, into a room that had been lifted halfway into a celebration. Around the hall, raised glasses came down by inches, uncertain whether this was a joke they'd missed the front of. At a table near the dance floor, a woman laughed once, a reflexive party laugh, and then caught herself when no one joined her. A fork touched a plate and stopped. Then nobody moved at all. Everyone in that room braced for me. I felt the heat go up the back of my neck first. The old draft by the kitchen door heat. The heat I'd felt every time a cabinet door stood open, and she turned to look at me. The edges of the room went bright and far away, the way the world does in the half-second before you faint. 150 faces had turned from her to me, to the bride in white, leaning forward to watch her come apart. At a table near the front, a man I didn't know leaned toward his wife and whispered something, a half-formed wait. "What?" And she put a hand on his arm to stop him. That was the scene my mother had written, and she'd cast it perfectly. The rescued one, humiliated in front of the people who'd come to bless her, crumbling at the head table on the best day of her life. But they were all bracing for me to break. I had done my breaking 2 years ago, alone, at 1 a.m, over a file. So the thing the room was waiting for had already happened, in a kitchen, with no audience, where it belonged. There was nothing left in me for her to break in public. She had brought a hammer to a wall that had come down a long time ago, and she swung it anyway, in front of everyone, not knowing the wall was already gone. I did not reach for the microphone. I did not stand and argue. I made my hands stay folded in my lap, where I could feel my own pulse in my fingers, and I kept them there on purpose. I looked instead across the hall to table 6, where my grandmother's hand had already found Sarah's on the white cloth. I caught Theo's eye for half a second, just long enough. And I let my mother go on standing up there in the good light, holding the thing she still believed was a weapon. I didn't flinch. I let her keep talking. Stop the video here for a second, because I want you to sit down in the chair I was sitting in. Your mother has just announced your most private wound to 150 people on the one day that was supposed to be yours, smiling like she's done you a favor in front of God and the whole guild. The entire room is leaning toward you, waiting for you to fall apart. What would you actually do in that white dress, in that chair? Most people picture the fight, the lunge for the mic, the shout, the walkout. Tell me in the comments, honestly, what you'd have done in that seat. And then, keep watching, because what happened in the next 60 seconds was something my mother had no script for. Here's the first clue to why. The reason she reached for that microphone wasn't strength. It was panic. Let me show you exactly how I knew. To understand the microphone, you have to understand what her week had been. 9 days earlier, my father had been served. The case was real and moving. The priest deposition was locked, preserved, beyond anyone's reach to bury. The attestations carried my father's signature again and again, years of them. My mother had spent her entire adult life as the architect of every room she walked into, the seating, the story, the sympathy, all of it set in place before anyone else arrived. And in the space of a single envelope, she'd lost the ability to control any of it. Her husband was named in a lawsuit. Her daughter was marrying out of the house, out of reach, beyond the swing of the kitchen door. And the people she'd spent 29 years dismissing as a sad teenage mistake were, she had somehow discovered, sitting in good dresses at table 6 in her own parish hall. What looked from the outside like a woman in total command of the room was a woman who had run out of room to stand. She did not reach for that microphone with a strategy. She reached for it the way a drowning person reaches for anything within range. She grabbed the one tool that had always, without fail, worked on me. The single word that had always put me back in my seat by the kitchen door, small and grateful and quiet. And she used it in the only room left on earth where she still felt like a queen. Her composure, that bright, managed calm, was the very last thing she still owned, and she was spending all of it at once. I had known for days how the night might go, and I decided in advance to let it. This is the part I'm not proud of, and I won't dress it up. I could have stopped her. I could have pulled her aside that morning, told her quietly what I knew and what was coming, and watched her fold in private. I chose not to. Not to set a trap. I want to be very clear, because it matters to me. I did not engineer my mother into reaching for that microphone. I did not bait her. I simply understood, with the cold clarity the work had given me over 10 years, that she was standing guard at the wrong door, and that the word adopted was a blade with no edge left on it. She thought she was holding a grenade. I knew she was holding a word. Here's what I mean by the wrong door, in plain terms, because it's the whole reason I could sit so still. My mother had spent decades protecting the adoption, the sealed decree, the covenant, the finality of it. But my being adopted was never a secret that could hurt anyone. It was just a fact she'd wrapped in shame, The thing that could actually end careers and reputations was the forgery. A doctor's signature swearing a coerced 16-year-old was sound. She was guarding the door marked secret with her whole body, and the real damage was pouring through the door marked fraud, which she'd never thought to lock. So when she stood and crossed the floor and lifted the mic from Theo's hand, I made a decision in my chest a full second before I made it anywhere a person could see. I leaned toward Theo, my hand light on his sleeve, and I said it low enough that only he could hear me under the ringing silence. "Let her say all of it," I told him. "Every word she says is one I won't have to." His jaw was tight. His hand was still half raised, still reaching to take the microphone back and turn it on her. Across the hall, at the back of the room, the family I'd invited was already shifting in their chairs, napkins sliding off laps. I could see the whole shape of the next 2 minutes laid out in front of me like a flagged document, and I let it come. Table 6 was already standing in my head before a single chair had moved. Theo's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the head table. I watched the anger climb up through him in real time. He was going to take that microphone back and aim it straight at her, and he had every right to. And it would have been exactly the wrong weapon in exactly the wrong moment. So I put 2 fingers on the inside of his wrist, the same place, the same light pressure Sarah had used when she touched my hair in that cafe, and I shook my head once. "Not like her," I said. "We don't win this her way." He looked at me. Whatever he saw in my face made his shoulders come down half an inch, and he nodded, and he waited. Around us, the room had already begun to move. Not loudly. A parish hall full of well-raised people does not gasp out loud. But it moves in small tells, and I caught them all. A great-aunt set her champagne flute down without drinking from it. A man halfway back actually started to rise, as if to intervene somehow, and then thought better of it and lowered himself into his chair. A teenage cousin near the cake table had lifted her phone to film, and then slowly lowered it, because some part of her understood this was not the kind of thing you posted. And near the front, 2 of my mother's own guild women I'd watched her lead through a dozen bake sales and fundraisers, turned and exchanged a single look I'd never once seen pass between them. A flicker of something that was very plainly not on her side. The story my mother had told for 29 years was meeting, for the first time in its life, a room that could watch her tell it. And the room was beginning to do the arithmetic she'd never let anyone do out loud. If the girl who gave her up was a sad teenager 3 states away, why had the bride gone so still instead of shattering? Why was the groom not surprised? Why were 5 people at table 6 holding hands? You could feel the questions moving under the silence. We were not going to scream back. We were going to do something much quieter and much worse for her. We were going to let the truth walk in on its own 2 feet and introduce itself. There's a detail from that morning I didn't learn until weeks later, and it explains the microphone better than anything else could. While I was 2 rooms away getting dressed, my mother had spent a few minutes alone in the bridal suite, and she did what she'd always done in any room she entered, what she'd done to a butter cookie tin and a cabinet door and the whole of my childhood. She went through it. My clutch was sitting open on the vanity. Inside it, folded down, small to fit, she found a square of paper, and she unfolded it. It was Maeve's drawing, the girl with my face, and on the back, in a 17-year-old's careful, looping hand, 4 words. "From Maeve, your sister. Mom's been waiting." I can only picture her standing alone in that quiet room, in her mother of the bride dress, reading the word sister, reading the word mom, a word she'd spent 29 years making sure belonged only to her, understanding, all at once, and far too late, that the past was not a sad sentence she'd authored and could revise. It was people, living people, and they were coming. They would be in the room, in good dresses, when she rose to give her blessing over my marriage. She refolded the drawing along its old creases, She placed it back in the clutch, exactly where it had been, angled the same way, because she was always, always careful to leave a room looking untouched. Then she fixed her lipstick in the mirror. And she walked back out into the reception. And for the better part of an hour, she smiled at my guests and accepted their compliments on the flowers, carrying the word sister around inside her like a swallowed stone, deciding what to do with it. That, I think, is when she decided to get there first, to say it before they could be introduced. To put me back in my seat one last time, in public, before the people at table 6 could stand up and prove the seat had never been mine to begin with. Theo took the microphone back out of her hand. He set his own glass down on the table first, deliberately, and turned to face the whole room before he spoke. He did not raise his voice. "I'd like to introduce," he said, and let a beat pass, "the people who've loved Della her whole life, even when they weren't allowed to." He didn't point at my mother. He didn't look at her at all. He didn't have to. And coming from him, the groom, calm, certain, the one person in that hall with the clearest right in the world to be furious and choosing visibly not to be, it landed harder than any shout could have. Somewhere near the middle of the room, a woman let out a long breath. The kind you let out when you finally understand which way a story is about to turn. And the sentence did something my mother's announcement never could. Hers had been an accusation dressed as a confession. Look what she is. Look what we took in. His was an introduction. 6 words that turned the whole frame inside out. There was no shameful secret here to expose, only a family that had been kept away, and a room full of people who had just been told, gently, that they'd been clapping for the wrong story for an hour. You could see it move across the tables, face by face, the slow turn from pity for the parents to something colder and more accurate. He hadn't raised his voice once. He had simply opened a door and pointed and let everyone look through it. 40 feet away, at table 6, a woman in a navy dress set down her napkin. I watched it. Slow, silent. Sarah's hands first, smoothing the napkin flat on the cloth. Then my grandmother's hand, finding Sarah's and pressing it. Then Bridget turned to look at her mother. Then Connor's palm went flat on the table, bracing. Maeve was already crying. Then Sarah stood, the legs of her chair dragged back across the parish hall floor. And in that whole silent, suspended room, the loudest sound in the world was one chair sliding back from one table. It seemed to go on for hours, that sound. It probably lasted a second. I will hear it for the rest of my life. My father had turned his head toward table 6. I watched it turn. I watched his eyes find the woman in navy. And I watched his fingers tighten, slowly, around the stem of his glass. He knew her face. Of course he knew her face. He had signed the paper that took her child. 1 chair, then a second, then, almost together, 3 more. 5 people stood up. Sarah, in navy. My grandmother, Deirdre Coyle, 67 years old. One hand pressed flat against her own chest, her eyes already on me. Bridget, who taught 2nd grade and talked with my hands. Connor, 19, who refilled water glasses the way I did. And Maeve, last of all, 17, rising with the tears running freely down her face, not bothering to wipe them. 150 heads turned as one toward the back of the hall. I want you to understand what I was looking at. For my whole life, I had risen to fetch and carry, while the people at my table stayed seated. I had never once, in 29 years, watched a room full of people stand up on my account. And now, here were 5 of them, on their feet, and they were on their feet for me. My grandmother's hand was over her heart, and she was looking at me, the way you look at someone you have waited your whole life to see walk through a door. Maeve's voice came out small, but the room was so silent that it carried to every corner. That's our sister. 2 words from a 17-year-old. and they rearranged the entire room. Every story my mother had told at every Christmas, every sad shake of the head over the girl who gave me up, collapsed in the space those 2 words took to cross the floor. The sad teenager was standing up. She was 67 now and had her hand on her chest, and she had brought her whole family to claim a granddaughter in public, in good dresses, on a Tuesday in May. 5 strangers to that room, my whole family. My father's glass left his hand. I saw it before I heard it. I saw his fingers open, not drop the glass, open around it, the way a hand opens when the brain behind it has stopped sending instructions. The glass fell. It hit the parish hall floor and burst, and the sound went through the silent room like a struck bell, sharp and final. Near him, a guest half rose in alarm, thinking he'd taken ill, reaching toward him. He waved them off without looking. He was staring at the floor, at the pieces, and I watched his face go through the whole calculation. The navy dress, the 5 chairs, the word sister, the envelope from 9 days ago, and arrive, all at once, at the only place it could. He didn't drop it because Sarah was standing there. He dropped it because of what he had signed the year I was born. It was the sound everyone in that room misread as surprise. I was the only one who heard it correctly. It was the sound of being caught. I want to tell you what was actually lying on that floor, in pieces at my father's feet. A doctor's signature. Years of them. The home that took me kept a physician on call. A man whose name appeared over and over on the medical forms that swore each frightened girl was of sound mind and acting freely. The sign-off that made the whole machine look like medicine instead of what it was. Without that signature, the coercion stood there naked. With it, the entire thing put on a white coat and walked past the law. I did not make a speech about it in that moment. I'd learned over 10 years and 1,000 files how to let the facts simply sit on the table and do their own work. Renata's team had the documents. The priest's recorded deposition named the doctor's role in the home, even where it didn't name the man. The attestations themselves carried the initials, again and again, in the same careful hand. 2 tables over, a man I knew to be a circuit judge, an old friend of the family invited to celebrate, had gone very still, and I watched him understand it before most of the room did. Watched him look from my father to the broken glass, and then down at the tablecloth, the way you look away from something you cannot unsee. A low murmur was starting to move through the back of the hall now. The people who understood what a forged capacity attestation meant leaning to the people beside them, the understanding spreading table to table like a draft under a door. And the man who had signed those forms, year after year, the man who'd looked at a 16-year-old's coerced surrender and put his own name beneath it as a guarantee of soundness, then driven home to a nursery he was decorating for the baby that surrender would deliver, was the same man who had told me at every Christmas dinner of my childhood that some things were simply better left in the past. I had called him Dad for 28 years. A 16-year-old cannot give a consent that a doctor has to sign off as sound. So he had signed off on a great many of them. And then he had taken one of those babies home and named her and seated her by the kitchen door, and let his wife tell a soft story about rescue at every holiday for 28 years, knowing, the whole time, exactly what his own signature had done to the girl, now standing in Navy 40 feet away. His name was on the lie that made me... My mother's smile came back, but it came back wrong, too wide, the corners straining. She turned and reached out toward the room with both hands. "After everything I did for you," she said, and her voice climbed, finding the register it had always found, the wounded one, the one that had emptied 100 rooms of their sympathy and poured it into her lap. "After everything, you would do this to me? Here? In God's house?" She turned toward the tables as she said it, toward her guild, toward the women she'd led on committee after committee for 2 decades. She was doing the thing that had never once failed her. She was turning to the audience that had always caught her when she let herself fall. The woman who had co-chaired the spring gala with her for 9 years looked down at her own plate. The parish priest, the one who'd married us an hour before, found something to study in the middle distance. My brother, at a table near the back, would not look up. One by one, the faces she reached for found somewhere else to be. These were her people, the ones who'd sent the casseroles, applauded her at the podium, called her a pillar of the parish. She had spent 2 decades banking their goodwill. And in the end, it turned out goodwill is not the same thing as belief, and she had never once checked which one she actually had. Not one person in her own pews would meet her eyes. I stood up. My breath was even. I held the microphone the way you hold something you fully intend to set down gently when you're done. For 29 years, I had called her Mom. The word had been a fee. I did not pay it now. "Patricia," I said. The name landed in the room like a dropped plate. Heads came around. I had never, in my entire life, called my mother by her first name, and everyone in that hall who knew us understood, in the same instant, that something had just been cut on purpose and would not grow back. "You told this room a story for 29 years, I said. And my voice did not shake, because I'd done all my shaking alone, years ago, over a file. A story about a girl who gave me away. You told it so many times you started to believe you were the hero of it." I let the quiet hold. You weren't. You were standing inside a building that took babies from frightened children and called it mercy. You were holding out your arms, and the man sitting next to you signed the paper that made it legal. I looked at her, and I did not look away. "You didn't raise a daughter who would break," I said. "You raised one who would read the file." I was not on trial in that room. I was the record. If you have ever had to stop calling someone by the name you used your whole life, if you've ever set a boundary so final it changed the air in the room, then you know what that costs, and you know it's the moment you stop being who they decided you were. If this story has found someone who needs it tonight, do one thing for me before the end. Subscribe so the next one reaches you too, and then tell me, in the comments, about the table you finally got up from. I read them. Now, let me tell you how I left mine. There was a second envelope that night, in my own clutch. I had brought it without fully deciding whether I'd ever use it. I crossed back to the head table, where my mother still stood, and I set it down on the white linen in front of her. Inside was a single page, a copy of Sarah Coyle's 1996 consent, with the time of execution circled in red ink. 19 hours. Clipped to it, in my own handwriting, 2 short lines. The plain legal truth of the thing. A consent procured under duress. A final decree that could not cleanse it. A signature below it that should never, under any law, have been there at all. She didn't reach for it. She looked at the envelope on the linen the way she'd looked at the metal in my palm 16 years before, as if not touching it could keep it from being real. So it just sat there between us, white on white. I did not read it aloud to the room. That was never the point of it. I leaned in, close so that the words were only for the 2 of us inside all that noise. "You keep this one," I said to her. "Read it alone," the way she had to sign it. I want to be clear about what that page was, and what it wasn't. It wasn't a threat. The case did not need her, and it did not need a scene at a wedding. The documents were already filed, the deposition already preserved, the machinery already turning without me. The covenant she'd had me sign at 18 could not survive a forged consent any more than the decree could. The page was something smaller and more exact. The truth she'd spent my whole life keeping out of my hands, handed back to her, so that for once she would be the one sitting alone with it. Then I turned around. I had given her, at last, the one piece of paper she'd spent my whole life hiding from me. And here is the irony I had carried into that hall all night, like a coal closed up in my fist. She had risen from her chair, believing the word adopted was a grenade. She'd been so certain of it that she'd spent her last good card on it in front of 150 witnesses on the day she most wanted to win. But every person in that room could see it now. The thing I had known since I'd opened that file at 1 a.m, more than a year before. The secret she'd detonated was the very thing that destroyed her. And the man beside her with the broken glass at his feet. The real family she had buried inside a single, sad sentence had been sitting at table 6 the entire time, in good dresses, waiting to be allowed to stand. She had aimed the gun at me, and it had been pointed at herself the whole time. And my calm had never once been shock. It had been knowledge. I hadn't needed a single second to absorb the word she threw, because I'd absorbed it years ago, alone, at a kitchen counter at 1 a.m, with the file open and my hands flat on the cold stone. By the time she lifted that microphone, the worst day of my life was already 2 years behind me. She had detonated a bomb in a building I'd already walked out of. I lifted my chin, and I said the last thing I would ever have to say to her. "You thought adopted was the end of my story," I said. It was the first word of mine. The room, finally, knew what I had known all along. I walked the 40 feet to table 6. The lights were soft over it, softer than the bright lights at the head table. The way the window side of the Christmas table had always been the softer side, the side I never got to sit on. There was an empty chair waiting. Sarah had her hand resting on the back of it. They had left it for me on purpose. 5 of them, at a table set for 6, holding a place open without any way of knowing whether the day would ever let me reach it. I sat down where I'd always been wanted. Bridget moved her glass to make room for my elbow. Maeve's hand found mine under the table and held on. Nobody asked me to fetch anything. Nobody's 2 fingers lifted off the cloth to send me to the kitchen. There was no draft on the back of my neck, because there was no door behind me. Only my grandmother on one side and my sister on the other, and an empty plate, already being filled by hands that had been setting a place for me every August for 29 years. Sarah drew the chair in a little closer, her hand resting once on my shoulder before she let it go. "We kept this open for you," she said. "We always will." Later, when the hall had mostly emptied, when someone had quietly swept the broken glass into a dustpan and the band had stopped playing, I took the medal out of my clutch and put it into Sarah's open hand. I told her I'd kept it since I was 13. That it had come pinned to my things from the home, that no one had ever told me what it was, and that I'd carried it anyway, from jewelry box to jewelry box, through every move and every year of my life, without ever knowing why I couldn't throw it away. Sarah turned it over slowly in her palm, the worn silver face, the thin ribbon, cut and re-sewn at one end with those close then loose, uneven stitches. And her breath caught in her chest, and her thumb went very still against the metal, resting on the crooked stitches she herself had sewn a lifetime ago. She was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and certain, and she did not take her eyes off the medal in her hand. "This was my first communion medal," she said. "I got it when I was 7 years old. They let me keep nothing in that place. They went through everything I brought with me when I arrived, the way she went through your room today. They left me nothing of my own." She closed her fingers around it. "So the night before they took you, I sewed this into the hem of the blanket they were going to send you away in. I pinned it inside your blanket so that you would have one thing in this world that was only ever mine. 29 years I had carried it and not known. It had always, always meant love." There was one more thing she gave me that night, and it was not an object at all. She told me that for 2 days after I was born, before the clipboard came, before the priest sat at the edge of the bed, before the pen was placed in her 16-year-old hand, I had had a name. Not the one chosen for me later, in a church basement, by people picking out a daughter. A first one. The one the hospital had written on the little plastic band around my ankle. The one she had read over and over in the 2 days when I was only hers and no paper had yet said otherwise. For 2 days, before anyone signed anything, Sarah told me, the bracelet on your ankle just said, Baby Girl Coyle. She smiled when she said it. It was the saddest and the most beautiful smile I have ever seen on a human face. I did not change my married name. I am Della Cardoza now, and I kept it on purpose, with a man who sat on a kitchen floor and listened. But I know now where I started. I know what was sewn into the hem of a blanket, and about the candle lit every August 12th for a chair that was never once empty in her heart, even when it stood empty at her table. For most of my life, that date had been the day I was rescued. It was the day I was loved enough to be let go. And then waited for, every single year, at a table that always kept my seat. The home took my name. She kept it for me.